Solutions ITAM webinar, Total Asset Management, the Managed Software List. My name is Lynn Weiss and I'm from ITAM and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. So before we start some things off here, I have some logistical items for everyone in the audience. Be aware of the fact that all your lines are muted except for those of our presenters today. And if you have any questions for the presenters, just click on the type message here box to your right and type in your query. Also, if you have some issues during the course of the presentation, I can respond to those as we go along as well. So all questions that are not answered during the course of the Q&A session at the end will be answered via email after the webinar is completed. There will be a link on the ITAM website as well as the eTelligent Solutions website, hopefully early next week, so you can listen in to the recorded version of this webinar so that you can attend and listen in with some other folks at your office at a later date. And for everyone that's ITAM certified, this webinar counts as 2 points towards your recertification. So again, welcome everyone. To start off, I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers. First, we have Brett Hasselbaugh, who is the CEO of eTelligent Solutions. And we also have Keith Rupnick, who is the Education and Content Director here at ITAM. So Brett, would you please start the presentation off for us?
Sure will, Lynn. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to talk about a concept that we call the Managed Software List. And during this webinar, we'll start by looking at some of the challenges that most people face, a lot of people face, when you're actually pursuing software license management. We'll talk about some of the considerations. A lot of projects don't stop to consider some of these, at least these two considerations that we're going to talk about. So we'll cover those. And then we'll get into the Managed Software List. What is it? How do you form it initially? And how do you put it under governance? And how do you communicate the concept out to the organization? So a lot of times when we're working with clients and the client's interested in pursuing software license management, there was usually some forcing function that really finally got them off the mark and to start. Could have been and oftentimes is an audit that had an unfavorable outcome, or it could have been just a long, arduous renegotiations, or true up with a vendor. But something usually finally gets it started. And so a leader is appointed, a team is formed, and you start looking around saying, okay, where do we start? And usually the starting point is, well, let's figure out what we got installed first. And when you start looking down there, so okay, how can we figure that out? Well, what information do we already have? And in most large organizations, there is a source somewhere of auto-discovery information. It could be Microsoft's SCCM. It could be several different sources, but there's usually a source of auto-discovery information. And so you find your way to the auto-discovery people, and you get a feed from them, and you get the information, and that's usually the first uh-oh moment in the project. Because what you get back, actually, from auto-discovery is a list of every executable piece of code on every machine in the environment, whether or not it requires a license, and whether or not it's part of something else. And this is an actual example. This is actual auto-discovered information. This was collected in an environment of about 10,000 machines, and it yielded 64,000, greater than 64,000 unique combinations of publisher, title, and version. That's over 1,000 pages of information. And so you get that 1,000 pages of information, and you think to yourself, there's just no way, we don't have enough time in our lifetimes to go through this and figure it out. You can look down this list, and you can see some of it's probably licensed, some of it's probably not, but each one, to really kind of track it down requires some research. And 1,000 pages of research is too much usually. So this is usually where the project takes its first detour. And the detour is, well, we got to find somebody who's got a library. And there are vendors out there that have libraries, but it takes some time to go search them out, and then it's additional costs that no one expected. And all of this is delay to benefits, and all of this is additional costs. So that's important. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that as we get into further into this. So a lot of companies are still stuck at this hurdle right now. It's a fairly large one to overcome. But let's say you get past that hurdle, then you find the next challenge. Now, I'm going to go back to auto-discovery just for a second, just one more piece of challenge in auto-discovery. Auto-discovery can find a piece of software on a machine, and it's very good at that. Once it finds the piece of software, what it can't tell you is what terms it's licensed under. And you can have the same piece of software in your environment licensed under several different sets of terms depending on the license agreement that was signed and the contract that was signed. So that's another constraint of auto discovery is it can find the software, but it really can't tell you anything about how it was licensed. So that's another important piece of information to keep in mind.
The other thing I'd like to add to that, Brett, is the previous slide showed a snapshot of the result of an audit discovery, and as anyone who's been doing software asset management knows, it is anything but static. So that data is only valid for a very short period of time.
Yep, good point, Keith. Thank you. So let's say you get past that first hurdle, or you start to get past it, and you start to get an understanding of, at least on some of the titles in your environment, what your installed position is. Okay, so next step, let's go match that up through our purchasing records. That should be pretty straightforward. Not always. Now, there are some, by and large, what happens, this is usually what happens, you end up finding out that you don't have enough purchasing documentation to match up to what you found through auto discovery. So you end up documenting an out-of-compliance position. That's not always the case. There are a few titles that you'll probably find you're over-licensed on. But by and large, you end up documenting an under-licensed position on the majority of the titles that you've got in the environment. So why is that? A lot of reasons. And you can talk to clients. I talk to a lot of clients, and you walk in and they'll say, we're a totally locked-down environment. No one can actually put any software on the machines. And you'll be surprised when you actually do the auto discovery that come to find out, oh, yes, they can. They'll coerce techs into doing it. They'll find a way to get software on those machines. We've had clients where the techs willingly put version Pro on all the machines, not realizing that there wasn't sufficient license coverage for Pro. And when we finally did come up with their compliance position, we found out that they were significantly over-licensed on Standard, because that's what should have been installed, and significantly under-licensed on Pro, because that's what was installed. So that's just one example, but there are many other examples of how software finds its way onto those machines, even though they're locked down. You also have clients who will say, yeah, but we got policies. People aren't allowed to pull anything off the internet. They're not allowed to actually go out locally and purchase anything. You may very well have those policies, but they still do it. If you actually go find out when the last time someone was fired for doing that, you'll find out, well, that's really never happened. And yeah, okay, they know that, and they'll still go buy the software. People will seek and find the path of least resistance, and that's how software gets into the environment. There are some publishers out there, they count on that. They count on individual employees pulling stuff down off the web that reports back to them, and then they come in and audit you and actually, more or less extract money out of you for a behavior that was happening that you weren't even aware of. So, the risk is, or what normally happens is, you try to match it up to purchasing records, and you find out that, uh-oh, we don't have enough purchasing records. You also have lots of different autonomous organizations, either geographically, any large organization has this, acquisitions, you used to have entities within the larger company that were former, were acquisitions formerly another company. They have their own contracts, and they aren't visible up at the level that you're trying to pull all this information together. So it takes time to actually try to go dig out all that information, plus the fact, the existence of what I call the back channel acquisition channels, people going through and pulling software off the web or ordering software through other than proper purchasing means. Okay, so that leads to the third challenge. Uh-oh, we just formally documented the fact that we're out of compliance. That's not what we really were hoping or didn't think about that. Now you've done that, you can't ignore it. So you got to be careful about how you go about understanding your compliance position, because once you formally document the fact that you're out of compliance, you can no longer ignore that. You have to do something about it, or risk being found to be willfully violating U.S. copyright law and other laws as well. But so you got to be careful how you do that, and a lot of organizations find that they just formally documented the fact that they're not in compliance. So in addition to those three challenges, there's a fourth challenge that's lurking about, and that is auto discovery isn't a panacea. Yes, it can find and help you identify and understand your installed position for software where it's a fairly simplistic license, where it's one install requires one license to cover it, which is generally in the workstation, non-virtualized workstation world. You start to get into server licensing, and here's a for instance. We have a client who, if you're familiar with a product called ServiceNow, it's an ITIL service desk and the full ITIL suite. It's offered as a software as a service, and more software is being offered that way. So the only thing discoverable in the environment is the fact that there's a web browser on somebody's machine. You really can't tell how many people are using this software as a service, not through auto discovery. So you have to come up with other means to figure out what your install position is. Auto discovery can't help you there. You might have Oracle in the environment, probably do, right? Well, is it licensed by user, by named user, or is it licensed by CPU? So you discover it, you can't tell it through the discovery. You have to know more about the license to understand, the instance that you found, how it's licensed, to really start to understand if you can figure out if you're in compliance or not. So these are a lot of the challenges that are faced, and you quickly come to the conclusion that this is a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. And a lot of companies that embark on this, they're still stuck in trying to overcome these challenges. We were just working with one. 3 years they've been doing this, and they still haven't overcome all these challenges. So hopefully the takeaway, or what we're trying to build up to, is the takeaway from these challenges is you have to do something to kind of keep the challenges overcomable, that you can overcome them. So you try to keep the scope to the point where these challenges aren't insurmountable, because they do exist. Okay, so let's say you're working through the challenges. One of the things that often happens is what should we consider about this pursuit? That's often not thought about, actually. You start, it's kind of a foregone conclusion, whatever the event that occurred that kind of started this. That's why we're doing this. So, it takes a life of its own as you try to overcome those challenges. You get so wrapped around the axle trying to overcome the challenges. You never really step back and say, why are we doing this? And what do we want out of this long term? And this is an important slide, and I've had this conversation with many clients, and I'm surprised at first it doesn't resonate. So it may not resonate at first, but it's worth kind of thinking through. Here's what I've seen. So 21 years I've been doing asset management, and been involved with over 50 implementations over the years, and not many of them succeed. When I say succeed, I mean last more than 3 years. That's usually the acid test. Can it endure more than 3 years? Usually what happens is there's some initial low-hanging fruit that are delivered, and that's goodness. But then after that, everyone struggles to figure out what value is coming out of that program, and why do we have all 3 people doing nothing but this asset management thing? What are we getting for that? And they come under fire eventually, and usually you have a difficult time justifying the continued existence of the ITAM organization, and try to get another head count. Usually the head count's under fire. They're trying to take away the head count you do have. And so you got to think through that. If you're going to be the one that's going to own this program long term, you might be able to kind of make the risk of audit go away as a low-hanging fruit and be a hero for a while. But that's not not always going to be long term. You have to think through, how can we continue to show and demonstrate value with this? How will we do that? And so usually the best focus we have found is focus on reuse, harvesting and reuse, and taking continuous dollars out by reusing licenses. And if you focus on that, you also have to address compliance. It's not necessarily a focus, but you do have to address it. If you're successful at taking cost out due to harvesting and reuse, then you're going to end up on somebody's radar screen, because they're going to see a loss in revenue in your account. They're going to come and audit you. So you definitely have to have your compliance house in order, so you can't ignore it. But if you focus on showing value, and we got a client who's doing this, they're showing quite a bit of value monthly through harvesting. If you take that focus and you think that that's going to be how we're going to sustain this long term, that's how we're going to sell this program and continue to sell it long term, it's going to drive you to some thought that you may not have thought about. And so, for instance, this whole back channel that I talked about that you found existed when you try to match up the purchasing records, you start to realize if we're going to demonstrate cost takeout, value, production due to reuse of software in the long term, we've got to shut down that back channel. Because if we don't shut it down, then all we're going to have is, if we were able to harvest any licenses and create a pool of unallocated licenses, they're going to continue to get consumed by all this rogue software coming into the environment. So we have to shut that down. We've got to figure out how we're going to do that. And the other thing we have to do is, if we create a allocated pool and unallocated pool of licenses, we got to have a way of throttling demand on that pool. If people find out we got a bunch of licenses around, what's to stop them from coming and say, hey, we need those licenses? Over here, we're going to use those. And so you have to have a way of throttling that demand. Otherwise, you'll still run the risk of not creating the value that you're trying to create. So once you decide what you're going to, you have a short-term, long-term focus, what your long-term focus is going to be, it's going to drive you to some design constraints in your overall project that you want to think about up front, not after the fact. The other thing you want to do is you want to set expectations of the executives, because that's how you're going to stay around long-term. If they think value's coming out of what you're doing, then you get to stay around. And so it's surprising, you might think, that the CIO understands exactly precisely why there's money being spent for pursuing software license management. But I can't tell you how many times I've done asset management health checks where I've go and interview the various stakeholders, and then I go and interview the CIO, and I ask the CIO, are you doing asset management? Yeah. So what are your expectations? Not one time has the CIO been able to answer that question. They fumble for an answer. They don't want to show that they don't know the answer to that question, but they fumble for an answer. So it's very important. Takeaway from that is it's very important to also manage up in the program and set the expectations of the executives. So you need to take some time to say, what's the short-term, long-term focus of this project, and why are we doing this, and how are we going to measure our success? Make sure everybody understands that, from the project on up through the executives before you start.
Yeah, and understanding the focus gives you the opportunity then to craft a message to the people that you have to sell the program to. So for people who are concerned about being audited, there's a risk management piece to that that you can sell to upper management. If it's about cutting costs and saving money, there's that financial aspect through software reuse. And then there's the efficiency gains of being able to cut out that back channel and streamline acquisition of software assets.
Yep, all good points. So that brings us to another consideration, and this one I find interesting. In just about every business decision, and maybe every business decision, there's an element of risk. And that element of risk, people do their best to understand it, to mitigate it, and then the decision is made to press ahead in spite of it. Okay, so there's some amount of risk that we understand and we accept. And you know what? It's prudent to accept some level of risk because it's almost always, if not always, cost prohibitive to seek a zero risk position. And yet when I work with companies, that's exactly what they're doing when they're trying to do software license management. They are trying to understand their compliance position for every title in the entire estate. And that's, in any given size of organization, that's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 plus titles, unique titles in the estate. The time, and I think they do that because they don't understand the cost involved with trying to track that many titles and how many, they think it's auto discovery will find it, purchasing records will match up to it, and so why not go after all of it? And it's, as we pointed out with the challenges, it's not that simple. There is some level of manual process intervention that's just going to be required, and that costs money. So what you really want to do is take the time, as you understand what your focus is going to be, also understand what your risk is, and take the time to do your best to quantify that risk, and then understanding the risk and how you'll mitigate it, move forward then. And usually when you understand the risk, that's going to lead you to a much smaller set of software, which is what we're driving at here, which is what we call the managed software list. All of a sudden, the problem becomes tractable, when you actually take this approach.
And the other thing I'd like to add to that is, as your processes mature, for example, the first time you start looking at risk mitigation processes, the cost of implementing that process is going to be high. But as you start managing more and more software titles, the costs associated with creating new processes and training and education is going to decrease significantly. So making it much more cost-effective to add software titles down the road into your process of risk mitigation.
Yep, that's a good point. I mean, just like anything else, you'll get good at it as you go along. So what is an MSL? We're talking about this concept called the managed software list. So at the easiest definition, it's a subset. It's a subset of the software that's in your estate. It's the subset that represents about between 80 and 90% of the risk of audit, and at the same time, 80 90% of the value of harvesting and reuse. It just so happens that the two coexist in the same subset of software. And so it's a little bit more than that, and we'll talk about how it's a little bit more than that, but let's just start there with the fact that it's a subset of software. So let's go back to the challenges for a second. So if we took this MSL approach, And we have whittled our list down to now we're looking at like 100 titles as opposed to 2,000. Instead of 1,000 pages of auto discovery information, we're only looking at about 20. 20 is doable. 1,000 is not. So you can actually get through 20 in about a day, maybe 2 days, as opposed to the 1,000. So all of a sudden, the detour that you had to take that was putting a risk to your ability to quickly show benefits because you have to go find somebody's got a library that can you can give it raw data and it can tell you every possible title that you could ever possibly come across. Now you got a finite list of titles that are defined. You can use the built-in training capability on just about every auto discovery tool and train it yourself. It's doable, because you're only talking about, as I mentioned, somewhere around 100 titles is what we usually see for the starting point for a managed software list. We got one client that's 47 titles. That's the starting point. And so suddenly, that bit is doable. This whole concept of highlighting, trying to match up the purchasing records. Well, guess what? You're now talking about, the mass, where you're actually spending money, where you actually got high ubiquity of software. Usually you buy that stuff through Tier 1 vendors. Usually you only have maybe a handful of those. You can go back to those guys and say, give us historical records. You can get electronically, and you can match that up to purchasing. It's a lot more tractable, a lot more easy to do when you're only talking about 47 to 100 different titles. And the risk of highlighting an out-of-compliance position is a lot lower because now you're only talking about a small subset of titles. You can control it, and at the same time you're doing this, you've done an analysis and you say, you know what, this other 1,200 titles, 1,000 or 2,000, 1,900 titles, they represent onesie-twosie stuff. The risk of getting audited from a vendor where we got 3 installs of $1,000 software, it costs them more to come audit us than they'll get out of us. So it's not like it's not going to happen because there's always a probability, but it's a really low probability. So we don't really need to focus on that right now. Maybe there'll come a day when we do, but right now we don't need to.
That's exactly
So
the approach that we recommend in our software asset management courses, is you can't boil the ocean. Start off identifying the ones that may pose the most risk to you, the vendor that you have purchased the most software titles from, and start from there.
Yep. It's good advice. It's interesting how many times, because just about without exception, every time I'm called in to help a client out, they are pursuing boiling the ocean. I don't know. I guess it's just seems to be the way you should go about it. But for sure, you want to narrow it down, understand where your risk is, and start small, where you can get some demonstrable value out of the program, and then build after you've can claim success on the first go. Now the MSL is a little bit more than just a subset. As I mentioned, it's a subset. That's the easiest way to think about it. But then it's a little bit more than that. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, when you have auto discovery helping you out, and you're going to want to use auto discovery in your solution to help you out. You got auto discovery helping you find software in the environment. It can find it. It can't tell you what terms it was licensed under. And so that becomes kind of important because one of the concepts that you want to try to envision or press with the MSL is the concept of transferability. We want to be able to transfer an MSL title from any asset to any other asset, from any person to any other person, from any geography to any other geography within our organization without having to fill out a form or call up a vendor and ask permission. We want that negotiated into our license terms because this is an MSL app, and we've designated it as such, and therefore we're going to negotiate the terms that we need to do with the software what we want to do with it, we intend to do with it, such as free transferability. So those terms, once they're negotiated, if you discover an installation of that out in your environment, you have to feel confident that that particular installation was purchased under those terms so that you're still, you know you're in compliance. Because you could have enough licenses showing that you've purchased and think you're in compliance, but some of those licenses or some of the installs were actually purchased under different license terms. And therefore, if you really dug deep, you find out you're transferring stuff you're not allowed to, and you could still get dinged on an audit for that. We had a client that just got dinged on transferring things across geographies because the license restricted it. So once you think of it this way, the MSL is your radar. Okay, you got high usage patterns and software that are visible now through the internet to vendors that you don't even think about, don't even know that they're watching you. You're on their radar, so the MSL is now putting them on your radar. So now that you're both on each other's radar, you can go out and be proactive dealing with these guys before they come in and surprise you with a surprise audit. This will uncover this MSL concept. I'll show you how to do this in a second. We'll uncover those because it's usually the ones that you don't even think about that come and bite you. And so they'll come up on your radar as a result of going through this MSL exercise. And that's all that needs to be on your radar right now. You don't need to be focused on everything because, as we mentioned earlier, it's too hard to try to boil the ocean and do it all at once. There's some other things you want to do with an MSL if it's an MSL title. You want to make sure you're purchasing it only from Tier 1 vendors. Most people do that anyway, but you want to make sure that you want to just take out the risk of buying counterfeit software, so that that's not a risk, because that could also be an audit issue too. If you find that you thought you were buying it from real software, but you're buying it through an unknown vendor, and they're actually selling you counterfeit software. And you want to make sure that it's an in-demand title that has harvest value, that people are going to continue to want to use and transfer throughout the organization. So these are all considerations when you're forming the MSL. So let's talk, okay, this MSL approach seems to be common sense, seems to make sense, okay? So if we do that, what about the rest of the software? Are we just supposed to ignore it? And the answer to that is no. Keep doing what you're doing. So in most organizations that I work with, at least, they're in this position currently. The position is they know about where they're at with some titles, some of the big titles. They could be licensed in such a way that they don't really have to care because they've got an enterprise-type license. But they don't know where they are with everything, and or even all the ubiquity stuff, the stuff that would normally be on the MSL. They don't know where they are, and so if they get called for audit, they have to pull together a response team. They're going to go digging for information. They got to go digging through purchasing and try to come up with a position, and then negotiate their way through the whole audit process. And you'll be in the same position with the non-MSL titles, with the exception that the non-MSL titles have a very low probability of that occurring. Doesn't mean it won't occur, but very low probability of being called, for audit. So you just keep doing what you're doing. Policies stay the same. Practices stay the same. You just focus in, and you're creating this designation called MSL, and that's where you're going to put your emphasis and your focus as your starting point, is the MSL. Well, it'll always be your emphasis and your focus, but this MSL can grow over time. The other thing you want to do with an MSL is you want to put it under governance. The decision of what titles go on the MSL and come off the MSL, that shouldn't be left to an individual. There are too many stakeholders in that decision. You want to make sure that those stakeholders all have a say in that decision. So if you're following ITIL and you've got change advisory boards established, go find the change advisory board that has the proper composition of stakeholders and just tap into it. If not, you'll have to form some sort of governance body, and we'll recommend the stakeholders here in a second. But you want to make sure that it goes under governance. And then over time, you want to continue to understand the ubiquity of software in your organization, because it'll change. And as it changes, and as titles start to kind of rise up in popularity within the organization, then they're candidates possibly for going on the MSL. You want to raise them as requests for change and then run them through the governance process and get them on there. So the MSL is not a static thing. It's something that continues to evolve as the usage patterns evolve in software and licensing evolves. So how do you do this? So this is normally what we do for clients. We come in and we ask for two pieces of information, or two sources of information. The first one is the source of information that the project usually starts with in the first place, which is that raw auto discovery data. So it's usually a very voluminous extract from the auto discovery system. Sometimes it could be upwards of 1 million records. It's basically all the titles, all those raw titles that were found on all the workstations or all the servers. Give us that. And so what we do is we form a curve. It's somewhat scientific and somewhat not. A curve, a ubiquity curve, and you'll see in a second how quickly that curve falls off. It falls off exponentially, and which leaves most of the mass, most of the ubiquity in a very few titles. Again, that gets you to the concept, the MSL. It's a manageable subset. But going through the scientific approach or the semi-scientific approach gives you a lot of confidence that you've covered everything. You haven't left something out there that some obscure vendor that's going to come bite you because they didn't pop up on your radar. This will definitely make sure you covered everything. So that's the first curve you form. The next one's a spend curve. For that, you go to the purchasing, IT purchasing, or you go to contracting, IT contracting, and you get historical spend, either by publisher or if you don't have that readily available, most of them have, they're tracking the maintenance contracts, the software maintenance contracts, and they know how much they're spending on that. So go get that. And you form the same curve on the spend, largest to smallest, and you'll see that that drops off exponentially as well. So it's interesting. It's the same shape curve both ways. Now, when you get the spend curve, usually what you'll get, that'll be, the ubiquity curve will be by numbers of workstations. That'll tell you or numbers of devices that the software is actually loaded on. The spend curve will be by dollars spent by publisher. And so once you understand the feel for the high ubiquity of titles within those publishers, in case you missed it on the first view. So there's kind of a second step to the spend curve. You don't stop there. You also have to consider industry-known aggressors. There are publishers that are known for being aggressive about auditing. Make sure that you consider putting some of their titles on your MSL. And if you've been audited before, chances are you're on the radar, so you want to make sure that they're on your MSL as well, too. So even if your ubiquity isn't high or your spend isn't high, they get consideration as titles that go on the MSL. Now, this first step could take maybe a couple weeks. Depends on how big your organization is, obviously, and how much software. But if you get your hands on this data, it's not a large time investment. But it's not where you stop. Once you understand or identify a subset of titles as a result of doing this analysis of, this is basically saying, where's our ubiquity, where's our mass, where's our spend mass, where's our installed mass. And now we understand the intersection of that, we understand basically where our risk is, and we understand where our value is. You can't stop there, because then you got to understand, okay, now we got this subset of titles. How do we license all this stuff? What are the terms under which it's licensed? Does it support transferability today, or do we have to get that negotiated in? Another little negotiation point that's almost always overlooked is that the vendor will accept, or the publisher will accept, proof of purchase as proof of license. If you actually go out and look at the U.S. copyright law, and I'm not an attorney, but we hired one who went and did this research, and if you're interested, the white papers that she authored are up on our website. But anyway, she went out and did this research, and specifically looking to see if the law supported proof of purchase equals proof of license, and it does not. Proof of license is whatever the license says is proof of license. So if there's language in the license, a lot of times the license is silent on it, but if there's language in the license that says you got to produce this little obscure hologram thing that we send you, then you got to produce it. So get that out of the license terms if it's in there, and make sure you specifically say that the publisher will accept proof of purchase as proof of license. So here's an example. This is a real example. It's been sanitized, but this is the ubiquity curve. This is looking for massive installs. And along the horizontal axis, those are they're numbered right now, but those are the numbers of unique combinations of publisher, title, and version. If you recall back to the information that was presented out of AutoDiscovery, the raw information. So in this particular example, there were a little over 26,000 unique combinations. Okay, so that's going along the horizontal axis. Along the vertical axis is the number of machines each of these unique combinations of titles are installed on. You can just visually just eyeball this and look where the knee is. And the knee cuts off right at around 572. Well, 572 is about 15 pages of information, as opposed to several thousand. So it's a fairly straightforward. Like I said, it takes about a couple days to go through this list of ubiquity, and even going up on the web and researching titles that may not be recognizable and making sure that they are require a license or don't require a license. But even with that factored in, a couple days will get you there. So this is the ubiquity starting point, and you get the information from AutoDiscovery. And at the same time, you don't want to leave out the spend data, because there could be some titles where you got low ubiquity but high spend, very expensive titles. They'll come out in this view. But you can see it's the same shape of the curve, got the same knee going on, same exponential decay. And so within 11 publishers, we've got the massive spend. And so 11 publishers, 572 raw titles. Within this 572 raw titles, about 100 will pop out. Intersect these two, and that'll identify for us, as I mentioned, somewhere. The usually starting point is around 100 titles. And then when I say 100 titles, that's 100 titles, but not 100 families. A family being multiple versions within a title, so that's versions included. So you'll have 100 titles, but you might have Adobe Acrobat Pro and Adobe Acrobat Standard, each one with 4 versions, 4 titles, so 8 titles taken up just by Acrobat, for instance, when you form your initial starting point. So we talked about governance, and we talked a little bit about how this should be governed. And what you want to do is look around. Obviously, if you don't have to reinvent the governance, then don't. Tap into something that already exists. As I mentioned, if you're following ITIL, and a lot of organizations do these days, if you have a change advisory board that has composition that closely resembles some of the stakeholders that we show here that are typical stakeholders in this decision, then see if you can tap into that and just run the change requests through them. Otherwise, you'll have to go out and try to bring these stakeholders together in some sort of governing body so that whenever a decision is to be made as to what goes on the MSL, what comes off the MSL, that these positions are all consulted in that decision and have a say in that decision. But that's a very important part of the MSL, is to make sure it goes under governance. And then you don't stop with just forming it, researching the contracts, start to work towards getting the terms negotiated that support your intentions for MSL titles. You need to make sure the organization understands that there's this thing called an MSL, and it's a little bit more important than your average software title, meaning, yeah, you got to go get this through prescribed channels. You can't go pulling this off the web yourself. And if you pull it off the web yourself, now normally what we like to do with our implementations is, the way we shut down back channel purchasing of MSL titles is we charge people. If we find it on your machine through auto-discovery, you can charge for it. I don't care how you paid for it or if you paid for it. We have no idea what terms you bought it under, so you're going to get charged for an MSL license. That stops that back channel pretty quickly.
I think also the benefit is with the analysis that you've done too. When you start saying to people, look, you can't just go out and buy Office at Best Buy anymore. You need to go through us. And they say, why? You're going to sit there and say, well, we have 10,000 users of Office. We're spending X amount of dollars on it. It's a big spend. We have to manage that expense. So
yep, very good point.
More of an opportunity for you to sell that need for that program to the end user and to the people within the organization.
Yep. But it is important that you get the word out to folks. You just can't be silent on this. Get them to understand it's an ongoing process. You use multiple media. You might have an intranet. You might send out tap into whatever media you use to get the word out to people. But make sure you go through the marketing people and say, we got a message we need to get out to people, and then come up with how you want to communicate that in a phased approach, and how you want to get the message out to them and the audiences you're trying to reach. But you want to get everyone in the organization to understand that we get this thing called an MSL, and it's to be treated with a little more respect than the average piece of software, kind of like the way you would treat company private information. It's to be protected. It's to be different processes to be followed. And so get that understanding, because as I mentioned earlier, if you don't shut down the back channel, whether you're going for compliance or whether you're going for value production, you'll struggle at both, because you'll have software entering, being discovered, yet you won't have matching purchasing records. So eat up licenses you are able to free up that you shouldn't have to eat up, or you'll have to be going out and buying licenses that you may not have bought yesterday because you didn't know you were out of compliance. So now you've documented it, so you got no choice. So you could actually put yourself in a worse position if you don't shut down that back channel. So that's one of the critical elements of being successful at this, is shutting that back channel acquisition down. And so this communications program is one of the key elements to getting that shut down. You can try policies, but my experience with policies is that they don't get communicated well, and unless someone gets fired and made an example of, no one respects them anyway. So that's why we usually use the financial motivator. That definitely gets people's attention because it shows up on their budget, and also just kind of building awareness is also a way of being successful at this. So with that's the concept. Managed software list, definitely a good starting point. Grows over time. Make sure you put it under governance. Make sure you communicate it out, and it will cover about anywhere between 80–90% of your risk and value, all in about 10% of the titles in your environment. So that'll open up the questions.
All righty. We have a number of questions that came in today, in regards to the presentation itself. As I said earlier, the recorded event will be out on the websites for you to download. But if you're interested in a copy of the presentation, I think, Brett, if you could flip to the final slide.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you.
You can send an email to Keith Thompson, the VP of Marketing and Intelligence Solutions, and he will send you a PDF copy of the presentation. So that is available for those that request it. Some of the other questions that have come in, during the course of the presentation, you had mentioned the term harvesting, and what do you actually mean by harvesting? Because I know some folks think of it in different terms, so can you give them a definition of what is meant by that in terms of this presentation?
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah, sometimes you get so used to using the term, you forget that it's not necessarily commonly used. Well, actually, we refer to it, we divide a line between an authorization to have an MSL title on a particular asset and a license that may or may not be covering that authorization currently. The authorization, giving up voluntarily or through other means, giving up that authorization, no longer being authorized to have that software on a particular asset, that's called harvesting in our parlance. And you know, sometimes it's voluntarily given up by an end user who says, I no longer need this software. And sometimes it's automatically triggered at disposal. Disposal triggers auto harvests. So it's basically recapture of authorizations of MSL titles that basically what it ends up doing is it reduces your installed count. So therefore, the licenses you do have, you know, all of a sudden yesterday you may have been out of compliance. If you got a harvesting program going on, tomorrow you can be in compliance again because you've, through harvesting, reduced your installed count as a result.
Great. Along the same vein, can you elaborate on the term transferability?
Yeah, so here's an example. If you go research the terms of an OEM license, so a lot of organizations might buy the operating system with the PC, and oftentimes that PC comes with an OEM license on the operating system. If you go look at the terms of the OEM license, that operating system cannot be transferred to any other asset ever. And so it lives and dies on that asset. Whereas transferability, if you've got that negotiated into your license, you can take it off of an asset and put it on another asset, and the license allows you to do that. So not all licenses allow you to transfer the software from one place to another. Some of them have geographic restrictions. You know, you're licensed to use it in North America only. You know, you can't send it over to Asia or vice versa. So you want to try to, you know, remove those terms from the license. They come about as a cost savings measure by the local organizations generally trying to save money, who negotiate those terms in. They feel like, well, we'll never have a need to use this anywhere outside our geography, so yeah, we'll agree to that. But when you start elevating that license to visibility and use on the MSL, and you want to transfer it now, you want to go back and revisit those restrictions in the licenses and get as many of them removed as you can.
Okay, compare the differences between MSL and DSL, the Definitive Software Library, or in idle speak, the DML, Definitive Media Library.
Yeah, so the DSL, you know, a list of all the CIs that are software, they could intersect, probably would intersect, but there could be developed software in the DSL. Internally developed software. You'd never find that on the MSL. There's no license ramifications. So in the MSL, you're really looking at it from a perspective of how do I maximize or optimize the licensing. You know, so I want to look at where my biggest spend is, my biggest risk is, and I want to make sure I'm transferring licenses back and forth so that at any one time I've got, you know, no unused licenses basically. And so your purpose for forming the MSL is a little bit different than, you know, the purpose of the DSL, but that would not mean that there's not a high degree of intersection between the two, you know, in terms of titles that are on both of them.
Okay.
Actually, Brett, also for ITIL, the DSL is defined as a secure location for the actual physical media and the software. But the MSL is more of a company policy foundation.
Good point, Keith. Thanks.
How long would you expect it to take to form a managed software list, generally speaking?
So in organizations, so the largest organization I've worked on had about 120,000 employees. That took about 2 months, I guess, to form. one recently, about 5,000 or so. Took about, well, I had the data available, so it took about 2 weeks to form the phase one. Phase one is getting to that point of intersection of the two curves, understanding your candidate list. That's phase one. You can get there pretty quickly. And you can probably press ahead with that list, but what you want to do while you're pressing ahead is go back and research the contracts. How did you license these titles? How are they in the environment? That takes a little bit longer because you got to go pull together a bunch of information. And that depends on a lot of factors, right? So it's really hard to predict how long that will take. A person who works at the company would have a better indication because it's like, are we highly diversified and people are free to contract for this software all over the place, or are we highly centralized? Do I have one place to go for this information? Do I have 15 places I don't even know about yet? So I mean, that will dictate how long phase two takes. But once you get phase one done, you can press ahead, as I mentioned, while you clean up house in the contracting side and understand where you're at.
Great. This is a rather lengthy question, so I'll read the whole thing here. What are your thoughts on titles that don't have harvest value but have a tendency over time to drift out of compliance? For example, there are often distributed server products that are line of business applications where the owner loses focus on licensing. Does a yearly internal self-audit at this point make sense?
So that's a good question, and we have clients that certainly have, the criteria I mentioned for an MSL candidate. They've got titles on their MSL that don't qualify, as an MSL candidate, and they got them on there for their own reasons, and that would be, an example of what you just described. You feel risk, and you want to, you feel you need to mitigate that risk, so you put it on the MSL, and that's, again, it's a governance decision, and if you can sell the risk to the stakeholders, then for sure it would go on the MSL. So the MSLs, the criteria I outlined, that's a kind of a general criteria you'd want to apply to understand what should and shouldn't be on an MSL, but that doesn't preclude any other title in your estate from being put on there. What you don't want to get to is every title on the MSL because you'll spend money needlessly trying to keep up with that.
Okay, we have a number of questions all kind of centering around the same back channel issue, one in reference to a college scenario where the university machines are locked down, but then you have the staff where the professors, et cetera, are constantly downloading and doing what they please. How do you give us, or can you give them some additional recommendations as to stop this type of activity?
Yeah, the only way, so 21 years doing this, the only way I found that works, and it definitely works, is you charge them. So auto discovery, what we do is we set up, our solution usually has auto discovery, finds what we call rogue software. You set up a prescribed channel, whatever that channel is. Usually it's a portal that they go to request MSL titles. Okay, so they go through there, then they went through prescribed channels, fine. Otherwise, auto discovery finds it. You check your records. Did it go through prescribed? No. Oh, it's a rogue discovery. The rogue discovery gets charged. You get charged through prescribed channels anyway, but you get charged on rogue. And you tell everybody that through this communications program. That definitely curbs that because they realize they're going to be pinpointed as the person that caused a charge to hit the budget, for whatever budget they work under. And so we have found that curbs that behavior big time.
Is that usually,
and that's you can have policies, you can have other things in place. I've never seen any of that work, but the financial thing works.
Brett, does that charge for the rogue item exceed usually what the cost would be for purchasing it through the correct channel?
No, same price.
Okay.
What you're basically telling when you send out the communications, you're elevating this concept of MSL in people's minds. This is a special piece of software. We've negotiated centralized special terms for the software so we can reuse it and get the maximum value out of it. So if we find it on your machine, we have no idea how you licensed it. And just to be sure, so we know we're in compliance, you got to pay for an MSL license. You might have some other license, but you got to pay for an MSL license. So we're going to charge you for it if we find it on your machine. And so, it's justifiable on it. That system works. That's my strongest advice. If you're going to try to shut down the back channel, that works.
Okay, there are a few other questions here that are centering around modifying contracts and changing terms such as transferability, dealing with OEM-based contracts, and they seem to all point towards the fact that they're very difficult to get modified after the fact. What is your experience on that?
Yeah, that's true. They are. You got to wait till the renegotiations comes up when you got leverage. So you got to live with what you got to live with. When you go through that contract review, you might pull some titles off the MSL and take visibility away for a while until you come back around for renegotiations. When you got leverage and if you got sufficient volume, see the MSL titles represent sufficient volume, so you should have enough purchasing power to have a little dictatorial position in terms of you just never thought to do it before, but now you think to do it, you might find that the publisher has no problems with some of these terms you're trying to negotiate in. I mean, I've got a client who I asked him the other day, I said, have you ever had any of these issues with transferability across geographies? Because I'm running into that with other clients. I said, no, I take it out. Every time they try to put it out, I take it out. And so he's not had any problems, negotiating once you establish the MSL. But there's definite bring-up period as you get your contracting house in order. And that could take a year, could take years, but you just kind of work through that. But that is a good question.
When implementing and harvesting and reuse of software, how do you manage the internal market, for example, getting groups to release the software?
Yeah, another good question. So again, we get back to the whole financial thing. What we normally do is we put in a credit and incentive system, so that if you have a piece of software that you're not using, see the thing is that most people feel like, well, our department paid for that, so why would I give it up? I mean, we might need it someday, and if I need it, I got to buy it again. So what we normally do is we put a buyback program in place, a credit system. So if you have a piece of MSL software and you say, well, I'm no longer using it, if you offer it up for harvest, and if it gets redeployed, so it's not, you don't just get a credit just because you offered it for harvest, but if it offered for harvest and it gets redeployed, you get credit back for it. Same whatever the going price is for it, basically. So there's your incentive to harvest licenses you're not using, and that incentive system works a lot better than metering. So usually the industry resorts to metering. You got reports that says, well, you guys are not even using this software. Why don't you give it up? It's still a hard conversation to have if people feel like they paid for it. And so you get past that by saying, well, we'll buy it back from you. Oh, okay, yeah, we'll do that. And so that's usually how we overcome that. The incentive to build that harvest pool.
Exactly. How do you identify installed software as being rogue as opposed to legitimate? Is it through the license key, or how do you recommend doing that?
So what we normally do is we put together a portal. See, the thing is, these are all kind of behavior driver questions, and they're great. Because that's really what you're trying to create is a new behavior within the organization, and the more you can be successful with that, the more you can be successful with this whole software license management thing. And so understanding you got back channel, you're trying to shut that down. Understanding you have to have a way of identifying when someone goes through the proper channels. You want to try to kill two birds with one stone and create the way of getting MSL software the easiest way possible of any other way of getting software, because people will always seek the path of least resistance. So a lot of thought goes into how is it easiest. So normally what we do is we put up a portal, and we have the portal walk through the approval process of getting the software all the way through electronically delivering and installing it on the person's workstation. And so that ends up being fastest, easiest, quickest way and most painless way of getting software. And so if they go through that, well, we have record of it. We have record of the fact that they went through the prescribed channel. And any other way we find it, not prescribed, must be rogue. So that's usually how we identify, what's rogue versus what isn't rogue.
Okay, a couple of questions, kind of similar questions. Is there a way to curb freeware installations by users? Do you recommend the same stance by charging them?
Yeah, you certainly can do that. I mean, some freeware, I've had clients put freeware on the MSL. Some freeware is not really free. It's a Trojan horse. You bring it in, you do a click-through, and you realize, we don't realize is you install the full product, and you agree to take it off your machine after you evaluate it for 30 days, and if you don't, you agree to pay for the license, and you're in non-compliance if you don't do that. And you never even know who does, who reads a click-through, but that's actually a contract you just agreed to. And so, there are certainly times when you want to control that freeware. And yeah, you could put on the MSL and charge for it, and that would curb that behavior. I've definitely found the whole charge thing definitely works in terms of curbing behavior.
Okay, and then in reference to that charge, if a company finds it's formally not compliant, in your experience, who usually pays for that software shortfall? Is it met centrally, or is there a specialized group that you've seen in many organizations that take care of that?
Yeah, that's a good question too. We've had clients, they try to, when you're doing the software license management, you want to be able to have visibility down to the budget level. So however you keep track of budgets, if it's a cost center, department, whatever, because you got to know how to charge the out of compliance. You got to be able to identify where the compliance issue is. And if you can't do that, then you have a lot of grumbling and growling because you got some departments say, if it's, especially if you're funding purchases department-wise, you got some departments or projects saying, we're in compliance. We bought enough licenses. We were very careful about that, so you can't hit me again with an allocation to pay for this shortfall. Go charge the people who created the shortfall. I mean, you get into that kind of stuff. So generally, you want to try to build this this system such it can give you visibility down to that level, so you understand. And if you got the whole incentive system, debit system, you're definitely charging the right cost center so that you have that visibility. And so that is a good question.
Okay, we have a few more questions, so I'll try to get through a couple more, and then we'll have to cut for the day. But one is, our organization has a roaming profile, whereas a user can log into any PC within the environment. What we have come across is that each application leaves a footprint behind, and thus, we believe, we are responsible for having a license for each so-called footprint. How do you work around that?
Yeah, that's a question I don't have a good answer to yet. We'll look for a better answer, but we got a client who's looking into that right now, and how to actually, so you also often goes hand in hand with virtualizing the whole desktop, so that you can walk up to any machine and your whole profile and your whole desktop comes down to any machine, and all that's done through virtualization on the back end. So that throws a bit of a complication into the whole license picture, and we're still working on that currently.
Okay, another one, I think this will be our final question today, is to what extent can you solicit or use vendor records for license purchases to fill in gaps for your own records? Do you find that a useful tool? Have you seen that done quite often, and does it provide you with any legal defensibility?
So the legal defensibility thing, again, will say straight up, I'm not an attorney, so don't take this as legal advice, not offered that way. But as I mentioned earlier, the copyright law, when we hired Katya, again, her white papers, if you want to read them, they're up there, and they go into great detail of all the research she did on the copyright law and contract law. The copyright law says if you want to prove you've got a license, you've got to do whatever the license says you got to do. So you may not even be able to use your records if the license says you got to produce some tangible piece of something that came with the software in order to prove license. So you should understand that first. But typically what we recommend to clients is, if a publisher is going to come audit you, the first place they go is to the reseller that's selling software into you, and they get their records. And so go to the same source and get the same information. We usually set up advanced shipping notices with the main vendors that you're pulling from, and we part of our solution is what we call the Advanced Shipping Notice Processor, ASN Processor. And we can go and get historical ASNs from these vendors and establish your current license position, or your historical license position, and then get the same information from them coming forward. That way your records should not disagree too far from what what the publishers are going to come with. And we found that to be successful. The solution has gone through several major audits with several major publishers, and we found that is indeed successful. So I usually recommend going to the same source. Now I have had one client say that they're a very large client, and they say, well, we did that initially, and we did comparisons, and we found our records were better. And so having had that experience too, you probably want to look both ways, make sure that the publishers are that their records are agreeing with your records. But by and large, we usually use the resellers' records as the source of proof.
Okay, I think that's going to be it for today. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar, and especially our presenters today, Brett and Keith. And as I stated earlier, all remaining questions will be answered via email after the session, and the recordings will also be available early next week from both the ITAM website and the eTelligence Solutions website. So for additional information or to address additional questions to either of our speakers, you see their email addresses up here on the website along with Keith Thompson's. And this concludes today's presentation. Again, thank you, everyone.